the leader, we are, for the most part, constructing followers as passive objects at worst, or as tools for a consequence at best. Like they are a means to an ends, getting our followers to do what we want for an outcome. This perspective obscures the complexity and sometimes chaos of the context or the situation. So we're going to do a quick word cloud here for a minute. When you hear the phrase leadership systems or leadership processes, what words does it bring to mind? And if you move forward in your phone, you can put in up to 10 words. You don't have to put in that many, but let's kind of generate a word cloud about, if you're thinking about leadership systems being this holistic perspective or leadership process, what words does it bring to mind for you? So perhaps it feels more in this notion of leadership systems or leadership process feels maybe a little bit more inclusive because we're talking about the leader and not just the follower, but it kind of maybe feels a little jargonistic or it's confusing. We're seeing empowerment, operations, performance, confusion. But we're talking also about development and management. Good, excellent. All right. So one of the things when we're studying leadership, I'm going to bring up a quote here in just a second. When we're talking about leadership, we often hear quotes like this from Simon Sinek. And Simon is a great speaker and he has a lot to provide about leadership. So I'm not trying to diss Simon here, but I'm trying to make a point. So here's this quote of his that's very popular. Leadership is not about being in charge. Leadership is about taking care of those in your charge. I have a lot of quotes from Richard Branson and a lot of other respected leaders where leadership is tied, being a good leader is tied to listening to your followers. And that's great, and that's lovely, and that's wonderful. But there is an assumption that leadership, therefore, is only about the leader. And that's what I want you to break through. These are great quotes, and it focuses on the importance of focusing on our followers. It maybe implies respect or justice, perhaps ethical treatment, and definitely successful outcomes. But it obscures a few things. It obscures the fact that the leader and the follower are often interchangeable. We're going to talk about that more. It obscures the fact that leadership is often shared, that many people may be leaders all at once. I might be the official designated leader for a group, but somebody else might be the socio-emotional leader for a group. Another person might be the administrative kind of task-oriented leader for the group, that many of us may be leading at once. It obscures the fact that the context or the situation is changing and is deeply embedded and complicated. And it obscures the fact that the leader may not be the best leader for the situation. So great quote, but it really is only addressing part of the overall process. So Dr. Barbara Kellerman has been arguing since her book in 2004, Bad Leadership, that we need to be thinking about leadership systems and process, that we need to be paying just as much attention to the followers and the context as we are to the leaders. But she estimates about 95% of all leadership education is entirely focused on the leader. But we're really a system. And she says, quote, each of these components is equally important and impinges equally on the other two. We need to stop focusing on leaders only and recognize that they're in relationship with their followers and that both are embedded in a context that frames their performance, their behavior, their emotional state, and more. So this is the perspective that we're talking about today by focusing on leadership systems and processes. So as I started thinking about what Dr. Kellerman is talking about in terms of leadership systems and processes, it made me think of this metaphor. What leaders see about their followers and the context is really like this iceberg on the top of the water, that we're just seeing the stuff on the surface. And as leaders, what we're missing in our followers' lives is all of this iceberg that's below the water. What we're missing is all of this context below the water. And it makes me think about the last few months where a lot of city and county leaders across the country have been dealing with COVID-19 and pandemic issues, and so focused on getting PPE or creating testing sites or mask mandates, opening schools, closing schools, businesses, etc., that they may have been so focused on that they've been missing the larger social justice issues related to the pandemic and the concerns of the Black Lives Matter movement, of social justice and racial justice in this country. And so some of them are feeling perhaps a little surprised when their community members are really angry and upset with them because of things that have been going on, because they've only been dealing with a part of that iceberg. So much context is below the surface. Leaders see only very little about their followers and the context. So we need to be paying much more attention to followers. And in fact, Dr. Kellerman argues that as leadership studies in business management, we need to be paying a lot more scholarly attention to followers. And if we're truly going to be studying leadership, we need to be studying followership. Because what is a leader without a follower? What's a doctor without a patient? What's an attorney without a client? Attorneys without clients, doctors without patients, is much more research-based and theoretical work. But when we're working with people, we really need to be thinking about the people that we're working with. Leadership is a relationship and a persuasive process. Dr. Kellerman argues that there are no bad leaders without bad followers, and that we need to be spending just as much time paying attention to followership. Followers have to be persuaded to follow. They have choice and free will. They might be inclined to follow, and we need to understand that just as much. One of the challenges when we're talking about leadership is that there is a stereotype that leaders are strong and followers are weak. There's a hidden assumption that if the followers weren't weak, they'd be the leader, that they're weak because they're being led. But Dr. Ira Chalef in 2009 argues, and this is a long quote, so I'm going to read it to you, the term follower conjures up images of docility, conformity, weakness, and failure to excel. Often, none of this is the least bit true. The sooner we move beyond these images and get comfortable with the idea of powerful followers supporting powerful leaders, the sooner we can develop and test models for dynamic, self-responsible, synergistic relationships in our organizations. So we need to be paying attention to followers, because followers need to realize they have their own roles to play in professional and political processes. Followers need to be courageous, take responsibility, serve and support, and challenge and confront when necessary. You may have heard of the quote, "We need to speak voice to power even when your voice shakes." So paying attention to followers as part of that leadership system is very important. I want to now talk a little bit about, I have a word, I forgot I had a word cloud, I'm so sorry. So when we think about followers or followership, what words come to mind? So let's do a bit of a word cloud. Just when you think of followers and followership, maybe based on what I just spoke about, or when from your own perspective of being a follower or a leader, or maybe that Ira Chalef quote, what words about followers or followership come to mind? There we go. Docile, giving, less skilled, perhaps less seasoned. Yeah. Servants, kind, curious, service, support. One of the great ways that Kellerman argues that we should be thinking about developing when we're thinking about developing leadership, we should really be thinking about developing followership, because all followers have the potential, with skill, with some seasoning, with some time, to step into those leadership roles. And we need to be recognizing what perhaps, they're less skilled in some areas, but they might in fact be more skilled in some areas than the leader themselves. So support, service, again, definitely there is a relationship between pay, the economics. Many followers are seen and not heard, absolutely. Excellent. So so let's talk about the context and the situation now. And in terms of leadership studies, this is probably the least well-studied aspect of leadership. But if we talk about, some of my rhetorical scholarly friends on campus who've been studying the relationship between leaders and followers and rhetoric that connects the two, they've been looking at context and situation for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But the notion of context or situation is new in the kind of leadership industry and is really not talked about. So this picture here that I selected is not the end-all be-all example of context. It's just a quick picture that I picked up off of the internet to demonstrate just a few aspects of context that leaders need to be thinking about. So for example, if I, as a political leader, am entirely focused on the economy and am ignoring issues about society or the environment or ecology, that's going to come back to haunt me because none of these things are in isolation from each other. To kind of help drive the point home when I'm talking with my students about context or situation, the context or the situation might be an acute emergency. Meaning the example that I often give is, I might be the positional authority person in the front of the classroom that my students, that gives grades to my students and assigns the assignments, but they choose to see me as a leader or not. Just because I have positional authority doesn't mean I'm leader. But maybe perhaps I win them over and I get their respect and they identify with me enough that they see me as a leader. But then one day in the classroom, an acute emergency happens. The building breaks out in fire. I have a student who has a seizure. I've not been in that situation before. I'm not trained to deal with those situations, or perhaps because of my own experiences in the past, I freeze up and I am not able, I freeze up and I'm not able to do anything to help. And it might be that student in the back who has had that experience before, has gone through EMT training, or has seen a student have a seizure in a class before, but is a student who's never spoken, never contributed, and they step forward and they become the leader in the context or the situation. Sometimes leaders are not well matched for the situation because of acute emergencies. There can also be long-term threats. Think again of that iceberg picture that I showed you before, that maybe I'm too focused on the economy, that I'm not looking at the long-term issues that have been building, whether it's social justice issues in society, whether it's climate change issues in the environment. These long-term threats have been building, and then become in a crisis situation. Further, there can be developing complexity in the context or the situation that I, as a leader, may not be prepared for, but perhaps the followers in the organization or in the group are aware of that, and we need to be fully addressing. So this can be, I joke with colleagues and my students that you can tell how old an organization is, or how much like fraud or negligence that they've had in that organization by how many like approvals it takes to get something done, or how many forms need to be filled out, how many people need to process the paperwork. Because as organizations or groups get bigger or older, they complexify in their processes. And that developing complexity can be a struggle for leaders and followers. So all of these kind of build to aspects of the context or the situation. Kellerman argues that we really need to be thinking about context or situation as three concentric circles of team, organization, and industry. And one example she gives is the Ford Motor Company. So there's perhaps the production team or the research team or the marketing team, and then Ford as an organization that's dealing with leadership changes or strikes or salaries, that sort of thing. And then there's the industry level, what's going on for all car manufacturing companies, how, for example, are car sales down, or what's their market share? I would argue, and I am not smarter than Barbara Kellerman at all, but I would argue that we actually need to be adding two more pieces of context or situation to that. And that is both at the personal level and at the societal level. So at the personal level, what's going on with the individuals in your team, with your coworkers, with your co-followers. And we don't need to know all of the personal details of our colleagues' lives, but we need to maybe give them some grace when things are coming up for them, or that we know of or that we don't know of, if they're acting differently because their personal context is different. And we need to be recognizing things are going on at the societal level that might impact what's going on at the organizational level. So I'm not going to read this to you, but just a quick example of personal context. This is a story that came across my social media feed a few months ago. It's a story about how a leader in an organization overheard an HR representative just really berating a secretary for not doing a good job anymore. Her performance and her outcomes were down, and that HR person was berating this poor secretary. That leader in the organization understood that that secretary's husband had died just a few months ago. And her context, her personal context of that loss and her grief were such that her performance was lagging. But the way she was, but as an organization, as a leader, they understood that that person needed some grace, and did a little research into the HR rep and found out that this person has been berating a lot of people like this, and that the treatment that that secretary received was really inhumane. We need to recognize what's going on with our teammates and stand up for them as a follower or stand up for them as a leader, because their personal context influences how they come to be. And if they're performing or behaving differently, there may be something going on with them, and that we need to be gentle and respectful and kind and help them. So we need to understand what their context is and how it's affecting them and how it's affecting the whole team. Relatedly, I'm not going to get into too much detail about this, but we've all probably seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this is actually an updated hierarchy of needs that recognizes these kind of deficiency needs versus growth needs when we're lacking something. And then when we actually, if we have physiological needs, safety needs, social belonging needs, esteem needs met, then we can move into these growth realms and this additive cognitive need. I bring this up because when we're working on a team with each other, all of the followers on the team, we're at different levels of, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of assumes this linear process, and it's a much more fluid process. But as we're moving through this hierarchy of needs, if there's another news report about something that's happening, a social justice issue, my colleague who may have been working on cognitive and aesthetic needs may be just brought down based on that news report to issues of safety needs and social belonging needs because of social justice, racial inequity issues going on in the country. And we need to recognize an individual's context is movable, and that we need to be supportive and impact them as followers and as teammates. So we need to be thinking about, when we're thinking about leadership processes and leadership systems, we really need to be asking ourselves, are followers' perspectives considered in leadership processes? And we need to be thinking about who's the best leader for the context, because it may not be the person that we've traditionally thought of as the leader. So let's do another quick word cloud about context and situation. So when we talk about what aspects of context or situation have you seen come up in leadership challenges? So take a few minutes again to put in a few words about what you've seen happen, because they happen, but as leadership scholars, when we're studying leadership, we often ignore that context or that situation. Time, yeah, time is a huge issue related to context. I often tell my students, I use an example of, we as a team might be very focused on speaking with each other respectfully, but we're working on a project and the time is running out of on the project, and all of a sudden we're time pressured, and now we might not be speaking so respectfully anymore. So diversity of participants is absolutely important to think about in terms of the context and the situation. And what are all of the contexts and situations those individuals are bringing to the table? We might be using language that's inappropriate that we don't know about because we've had a limited life experience. Physical space is absolutely, physical space is absolutely a part of the context. Grief, maternity leave, bereavement, those are all personal things that we bring with us when we're working with a group. And those are all part of the context for the individuals that the leader and the organization or the nonprofit or whomever you're working with have to address. Food security for sure, because we can't, we can't get to those higher levels of on like Maslow's hierarchy of needs if we have an empty belly, and that's the same for our coworkers, and especially for those of us who are working at home with kids going to school at home. Children, that change of context is really important. Calling in Black is a really excellent point to make, and culture. Thank you for that. I recognize that we're running out of time, so I'm going to move us forward. I want to kind of bring us back to this chart for just a minute for this quote, to remind you that when you're thinking about leadership, to kind of break off that notion that it's just leaders that we're talking about, but that we're talking about leaders, followers, and context. With this quote, what we see depends mainly on what we look for. So when you're thinking about leadership, think about what those followers and what that context is. So as we're wrapping up, and I'm going to bring up a couple of other slides, but as we're wrapping up, I'd love it if you would do a short answer for how this presentation has made you think differently about leadership. And while we're doing that, while you're loading that up, I'll come back to this slide, but I'll put up the references slide that we've been talking about as you're loading in your answers. So Barbara Kellerman's Professionalizing Leadership and Bad Leadership, and Ira Chalef's The Courageous Follower. And also, while you're bringing up the contributing to the short answer, I'm also going to show you the classes that the Leadership Studies Institute, the Institute for Leadership Studies, is offering through outreach and continuing education in the 2021 academic year. They're Leadership Studies 416. They're each 3 credit courses. 416 is Issues in Leadership. So we're doing 3 different sets this year, each quarter a different topic. So in fall, we're talking about improving organizational operations, which means learning to observe, analyze, and lead an organization from a systems, process, and people's perspective. In winter quarter, Dr. Holly Diaz is going to be talking about avoiding toxic leadership, recognizing the systemic influences and impact of toxic leadership. And then in spring, Dr. Suzanne Baker is going to be talking about daring leadership. And this is relying on some of Brene Brown's work to cultivate positive, productive, and innovative working environments. So let's go back really quickly. Hopefully some answers have come up in terms of how this presentation has made you think differently. But this is also the place where I can stop and you can also contribute verbally to how this, or ask questions about how this presentation has made you think differently about leadership. Any questions or comments that folks want to share? Oh, you don't think you can do that while I'm on a different slide? I came back. Good to see you, Art. Thank you for coming by. I appreciate it. Does it help that I came back to this slide at all? Okay. So I hope this was helpful for folks. I know that you're probably all typing in some comments, and feedback is really valuable and important. I feel kind of like I should be singing the Jeopardy song right now. The clarity about some context was helpful, good. And I really want you to understand everyone is a leader. That's the thing I really try and teach my students throughout. We have really got to break through some stereotypes about what a leader is. There is so much focus. Followers are so important. Leaders are never leaders in a vacuum. Leadership is inherently at least a 2-way process, and generally a multi-way process. And we really need to break through those stereotypes about who is a leader and who is a follower. We really need to break through those stereotypes. How are we doing on time, Meg? I think we're kind of out.
Perfect, perfectly timed.
Awesome.
So
Awesome.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. People may have a couple of follow-up questions. What a great job. You did.
Thanks.
We are so excited about the leadership series that you're going to be offering in executive education and our upcoming classes as well in entrepreneurial leadership, innovation, and coaching. So please do check out the offerings that Western has. So many great things to launch into our community. So any questions from y'all on the call?
Yeah, please. I've got plenty of time.
Karen, what interested you originally in leadership studies?
I started studying organizations, and so I really have to go back to that point. I was a business management major for a while, and what really started me interested in leadership issues was working in a corporation where the corporation put profit over literally the safety of its employees. I was the safety committee chairperson I was a concierge at a hotel chain, putting myself through college, and I served on the safety committee and became chair of the committee. And we went from having the worst safety record to having the best. And what I implemented was, when I say the best safety record, I mean as in 0 injuries. We were going from multiple injuries a day to 0. And all I did was implement basic communication tools. And then the corporation was being sold off by its holding company. And so they cut everybody to skeleton crews. And at our busiest time of the year, we had 200% occupancy in the summer, and we were running skeleton crews that we might run in winter when not very many people were traveling. And dozens of people, literally dozens of people in one day were injured. And I went to the safety meeting with the general manager, the food and beverage manager, all the top executives in that hotel chain. And they all blamed the employees. And I spoke voice to power, even though my voice was shaking, by saying, you were running skeleton crews when we had a convention of 15,000 people in this hotel and 200% occupancy. People were rushed, they got hurt because we were so overburdened with work. And none of you were here to say it. And that's why people were injured. And they told me instead that if any of those employees who got injured that day were to get injured again, they would be fired. And it was my job to then go tell the employees that this was a 2 strikes and you're out situation. You already have 1 strike. And I was 20 and a business management major, and I knew that this was going against everything my professors in my classes were saying. And I was just so shocked at the inhumanity of it. We were all essentially making minimum wage. Being fired would have been seriously a major threat for so many of the people that I worked with. And that made me want to study how we can be more humane in organizations and really focus on what leaders' responsibilities are. So that's what made me interested.
That's awesome. That's such a great story.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's interesting to me how many people are able to rise through safety situations, and how much our country has done great innovation through focus on safety.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
We just have to think about the person next to us and what's the environment that we're creating for each other. And that's what I was trying to do as the safety committee chairperson. And I was so shocked at how easily leaders, those in positional authority, threw safety aside so they could change the bottom line, because it was all about the quarterly reports and cutting labor costs so they seemed more profitable in the short term for a bigger sale. And there, to me at least, we don't have to throw people under the bus to make more money.